Honored to be able to have Sean Munson presenting today on frameworks for human-centered design of complex psychosocial interventions. So Sean is a professor of human-centered design and engineering at University of Washington and co-director of their ALACRITY Center, which is an NIMH-funded center grant, which I learned is also meeting this morning. So we are fresh on lots of innovative thinking about the role of human-centered design, health, and intervention. What a lot of us are here for. Has a very interesting background in terms of research and funding from several different agencies beyond NIMH, including NSF, AHRQ, PCORI, and Google. Recipient of the National Science Foundation's Faculty Early Career Award, and had previously been a political blogger and worked at Boeing designing airplanes. And on a personal note, I often phrase it that I've drinking the human-centered design Kool-Aid, and it is hugely in contribution from Sean's mentorship. He did a sabbatical at CBITs in 2018, right as I had just started here on faculty, or maybe it was 2019. But it is just such a treat to continue to learn from and work with you. And Sean's been an incredible leader in bridging the gap between the HCI field and clinical science. So thank you, Sean, for presenting today, and looking forward to your talk. Also, of course, as always, please put any questions in the chat.
Cool. Thanks so much. I'm really happy to be here. As mentioned, there's kind of this, before we go into it, if you're interested at the intersection of human-computer interaction and health, there's a growing/forming community on looking at what a future conference here might look like. I think lots of us feel a niche that is not currently filled by existing conferences for community building and sharing out certain kinds of papers. So if you have an interest in this, we'd love for you to scan this QR code and fill out the survey. That will help inform the planning, and there's also an opportunity in there to volunteer if you want to be involved in ways beyond planning a survey. All right, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about this challenge of how, in my work, what motivates me is that for many mental health concerns, people prefer psychosocial interventions over other forms of treatments, but these interventions are unavailable in many of the settings where people most access care, so primary care, schools, community health settings, things like that. And even if they are available in those settings, they may not be supported in a way that allows the existing intervention to be followed with fidelity, and so the treatment outcomes are not necessarily what they should be. Sort of a key hypothesis here, and also well documented by some previous literature, is that there's these underlying challenges that include intervention complexity, poor fit of the intervention to the actual destination context, so something designed and tested in a research setting when moved into these primary care or lower resource settings, or settings where just a lot more things have to happen, they don't necessarily translate well. There's also a concern that designs don't facilitate engagement, and again, particularly when the scaffolding of a research study falls away as we move to sustainment, that this support is sort of lacking, and so folks don't engage, and that also affects the outcomes. Also, poor fit to user needs and workflows, and that could be both the client's needs as well as the clinician's needs. And lack of support for ongoing fidelity, which contributes to kind of the well-known phenomenon of treatment drift, where it starts to look less and less like the actual intervention is designed. And so again, you'd expect that the outcomes are maybe not as good. A core part of my work is that human-centered design may be a way to address some of these underlying challenges. And I approach human-centered design from very much a training steeped in human-computer interaction, but broadly, I would say that human-centered design draws in a lot of fields to understand and address problems in socio-technical systems. It has a really strong emphasis on problem discovery and problem solving. I think its real strengths are in process and its ability to rapidly explore broad solution spaces before starting to down select, as well as different contexts. At the same time, I don't want to imply that breadth means that we are also unable as human-centered designers to do deep engagement with context. I think that's another strength of the field. Historic and current strengths include a focus on novelty, right? And if you've submitted Chi papers and gotten the feedback of what's novel, sometimes folks would say that there's too much emphasis on the novelty, productivity, safety, risk management, ethics, and engagement. And there's one model that I'll come back to a bit later of the human-centered design process is you start with a problem or a question of like, how might we do this? You work to understand the context that gets you to a better problem definition. You start ideating prototypes, ideally generating several before beginning to down select to a solution or an approach. And as I mentioned, my view of human-centered design is inescapably shaped by human-computer interaction. And so take that kind of, or keep that in mind as I talk through some of the approaches and some of the projects I've worked on. And we can come back to that in the questions of where maybe it, biases some of the ways that I'm looking at the space. At the same time as being relatively enthusiastic about human-centered design, I think its strengths can also be some of its weaknesses. So in its innovation, human-centered design process is not inherently aligned with theory. I think there are some really great papers out there that try to integrate human-centered design with the theories that guide intervention development or that help us understand health, but I don't think it inherently draws on that. And in particular, if we look at the way human-centered design is applied in practice, it can often be quite disconnected from it and spend a lot of time reinventing things that theory could have informed. I think different design traditions exist and can optimize for different solutions. So I called out earlier my focus on HCI. If you give an HCI person a problem, they will tend to come up with a computing solution to the problem, right? Whether or not that's what actually is beneficial for folks. And then service design, right, will focus on services. I do think that service design is in many ways a little more flexible than design traditions that focus on particular kinds of artifacts, but it still has its biases. I also think that in a drive to increase engagement or improve the user experience of a health intervention, there's a risk of innovating out challenging but psychologically important functions of intervention, right? So lots of psychosocial interventions require that people do things that are going to be uncomfortable, right? And the designer sometimes can be a little tempted of like, oh gosh, maybe, this is uncomfortable, let's have you skip it. But now, oops, that was one of the mechanisms that made this work. And so now we've actually just made the treatment less effective, even if people will do it more. And so maybe there are times when we want to do that trade-off, but maybe there are times when, or we should at least account for kind of how we might be subtracting things that matter. For about the last 6 years now, I've been working at the intersection of human-centered design and implementation science. And I think that this is a space where there's a really kind of healthy tension, right? And so where human-centered design allows for kind of this flexible innovation and exploration, but sometimes with these risks of like not enough boundaries or guardrails, implementation science brings a focus on supporting an intervention's core functions or mechanisms as designed, while still allowing for adaptation of that intervention or existing implementation strategies. There's this adage that you can't implement without adaptation. So it still allows for it, but it tries to constrain or put some boundaries on the ways an intervention might be adapted. I think it's also, really quite nice at thinking about how we might have to prepare sort of the groundwork or prepare a setting for an intervention to succeed through the ideas of implementation strategies or these adjunctive interventions that can help whatever core intervention we're trying to have succeed. So for those less familiar with implementation science, that might be, actually thinking about the kinds of training that are necessary, or if your intervention requires that people be able to attend face-to-face sessions, you may actually be thinking about adjunctive interventions that make sure that people who don't have cars can get to those sessions, whether that's by bringing the clinicians closer to them or by providing transit vouchers or stuff like that. Again, not knowing kind of how familiar the audience is with implementation science, this was something that I really wrestled with and trying to understand as a field when I was rapidly coming on board with our ALACRITY Center. And I found Karen's slide, which really does simplify things to be quite helpful, right? So if we're doing the intervention or the practice, that's the thing. Effectiveness looks at whether it works. Implementation research looks at how to best help people or places do that thing. And then implementation strategies are the stuff that we do to help people or places do the thing, with implementation outcomes being how much and how well they do the thing, right? And the idea being that how much and how well people do something is a necessary sort of prerequisite for sustained efficacy over time, or scaled up efficacy over time. And so my goals for today are to talk through 3 frameworks that I've been working with for guiding complex psychosocial intervention design. These are all grounded in mental health, but I actually think all of them would translate pretty well to other kinds of settings in which you might be pursuing a psychosocial or behavioral intervention. So the first one is going to be on integrating human-centered design and implementation science. Then I'll talk some about a new model or framework for coordinating human-computer interaction and intervention design in mental health. And then I'll talk about one that's still in development with the goal of increasing human-centered design and human-computer interactions, emphasis on implementation. This is kind of actually the first time that I've talked about the latter two in a talk, though one of them will actually build on a talk that Peter Slovak gave in the same webinar last year. And I've tried to leave lots of time for question at the ends because, if I think about who else is wrestling with this question, I think, folks at Northwestern are leaders, and I've learned so much, right? As Andrea mentioned, I was out there in a sabbatical to try and help me get ready to do this work, and I've really benefited from it. So I want to leave time for that conversation and questions at the end. Along that lines, I know that, these are more frameworks on top of frameworks that you also have, right? So your ALACRITY Center is guided by the Accelerated Creation to Sustainment framework. I would be really interested after I get through this too, in your reflections on ways in which they're complementary and ways in which, there may be different or have different emphases, in ways in which we're like annoyingly reinventing the wheel. Sometimes researchers have this tendency to just push another framework for framework's sake. And I've tried not to do that, but, I'm open to hearing that I've inadvertently done it. And I also really want to call out Yardley et al.'s person-based approach for developing behavioral interventions in this space as well, which I think also really tries to wrestle with this question of how do you take deep knowledge of people and context and integrate them with theory to design psychosocial interventions. So a lot of this work has been done or kind of is made as a reflection on work I've done in UW's ALACRITY Center, which has a goal of bringing together human-centered design and implementation science perspectives to redesign existing clinical interventions and implementation strategies, with the idea that this will ultimately increase the range of service settings where evidence-based psychosocial interventions can be accessed and successfully used. I've had a lot of really fantastic collaborators on this. I'll mention some as we go through the different slides, but in particular, I want to call out Pat Arian, who is the first center director, Aaron Lyon, who co-directs the center with me now, as kind of being real thought partners and figuring out, how do we do this in a way that is useful. Our theory of change at the UW ALACRITY Center goes back to some of those kind of hypothesized underlying challenges for why psychosocial interventions are not being taken up at scale, or why maybe they're not working in all the settings where people try and apply them. And so, the idea is that if we take an original intervention or strategy, we work through these mechanisms of usability, engagement, appropriateness to redesign the intervention or strategy, that should improve implementation outcomes of adoption, fidelity, reach. And it should also reduce these reactive adaptations. So sort of the idea that when you put something into a setting and it's a poor fit, you end up with a lot of often very individualized and very ad hoc reactions to try to make it work. But because they aren't planned for, they're costly to implement, they're costly to do, and they also may not be as designed and lead to greater levels of treatment drift. So some reactive adaptation is probably always going to be around, but by trying to minimize them and do them more proactively through this redesign process, we think we can get better treatment fidelity and better manage costs. And if we do this, it should lead to better clinical outcomes to reduce symptoms and increase functioning. And the way we do that is through this discover, design, build, test model, or DDBT, which I'll go into next. And so the idea of discover, design, build, test is it integrates principles from human-centered design. For those who are already very familiar with human-centered design, this probably comes across as a gross oversimplification of the design process. Yes, it is, with a little more emphasis on some of the implementation and service outcomes that we'd look at. So Discover focuses on identifying the viewpoints of interested parties, understanding the context where you intend for the redesigned intervention or implementation strategy to work, clarify what problems you're needing to address, right? So this is very much like encompassing that first diamond of the double diamond model. And then you go into the design, build, and test phases, where you're synthesizing the findings and insights, defining requirements for possible solutions, and ideating concepts. And then you hopefully build that into low fidelity prototypes, get some more feedback and validation, and refine the solution. And that kind of corresponds to the second diamond in the double diamond model that I showed earlier of design. And one thing I really want to highlight here is that though this is depicted as a linear process, you absolutely could end up backing up at any point in the process, right? So it's not uncommon that you go and you put something, a prototype in front of people, and many of you have probably experienced this too. I certainly have in my work, and you're like, oh, there is something I did not understand about their needs or about this context, and you have to back up and revisit, discover. Or, for it to be kind of more like a gradual taper, you're discovering less as you design more. It's not, these neatly discrete phases as much as we might like to think they are sometimes. At some point, you've done enough of the build phase, you've got enough preliminary feedback that you've got a sense that this prototype or prototype looks pretty promising, and you would then move it into a test phase where you're finishing out building these high fidelity prototypes, and you implement a pilot to evaluate the feasibility of the solution in a real world setting. You may also be getting some preliminary outcome measures. And so in this, we're really trying to emphasize working with these mechanisms of usability, engagement, and appropriateness. And so usability is kind of how well people can use the system to achieve their goals without errors, right? So are they avoiding making mistakes that could undermine the treatment quality or fidelity? The next measure is engagement, and this one has been really quite thorny for us to work with. Engagement is how much the client and the clinician are engaging with the system, but how much, I don't want to imply that it's all about time. It's also about quality of engagement. And we've had trouble figuring out really good measures for engagement. Currently, we're kind of asking questions that compare engagement to what folks thought when they designed the intervention should happen, as well as, observations to see, does that engagement look like it's good quality, or are folks just going through the motion? Time, is maybe not quite the right one. It could be over time, right? So how long does someone stay engaged? But again, we don't want to assume that forever is better. People should be able to graduate from interventions. There should be endpoints. Sometimes more time is good because people are investing and really trying to work through whatever they're supposed to be doing in the intervention. Sometimes more time is a sign of a problem and that it's burdensome and that maybe others wouldn't do it. And so, the figuring out the right dimensions and ways to measure engagement is still something that I think we're wrestling with. And then for appropriateness, we're using the intervention appropriateness measure, which is a short quantitative measure, as well as a revised goodness of fit interview to get a sense of just how people experience the appropriateness of it and trying to find problems with it. So in the center, our goals for this framework are for it to describe a process by which research and design teams can improve and evaluate interventions and implementation strategies in ways that influence center mechanisms. And so we have a lot of folks in the center are not coming from a human-centered design background, more coming from an implementation science background. And so you'll see a bit more of the emphasis on the design process and kind of really making it accessible in that framework and some of our supporting materials. Within the center, it also helps us organize our work and the work of project teams. So to do the center's science, we need to be able to get measures and information from projects as they progress through these phases. And so even though we know they kind of overlap, having this idea of endpoints of phases where we get some measures and help us kind of do some analysis of results and progress across projects is super valuable for answering our questions about like, what is DDBT or this integration of human-centered design implementation science doing overall? And I also hope that it will support the translations of the process we're using in the center and some of our results beyond the center by kind of, again, just being this organizing framework that helps us communicate and share out results. So I'm going to give a few examples of projects that we've worked on through this process and a little bit of how the model has been applied. I'm going to pick projects that are grounded mostly in behavioral activation and problem-solving treatment. Both have a lot of similarity in that they involve planning and following through with activities and goals. Behavioral activation is aimed to boost mood by addressing a cycle of depression through activity monitoring and feedback as people engage in repeated trials of hopefully pleasurable activities. Problem-solving treatment is about engaging people in selecting a problem that is important and relevant to work on, building their skills in thinking about steps they could take to address the problem, following through on those skills and appraising them so that over time they build self-efficacy to address problems that are affecting their depression. First project I'm going to pick here was led by Olin College, who was looking at goal setting planning steps across these different therapies and treatments. And so her insight was that if we go into and actually understand this sort of component or this module that has to happen in each, we get an understanding of what works well. We'd also get an understanding of maybe areas that could be improved or where there's design opportunities to provide more support. And that by looking at it across treatments or therapies, we could hopefully build some sort of principles or models that would be durable across them. The main result of that was a model of longitudinal goal setting that was shared out in a 2022 CSTW paper with this idea that people might start with multiple goals. They'll need to get down to a single simplified goal for focusing on, or they could also go over to single complex goal, right? People proceed through this in different ways. Sometimes the simplified goal leads to understanding that there's greater complexity to it, and that within each of these, there's a need to kind of tune and adjust the goal that someone is working on over time. And so it wasn't necessarily intended this way, but one of the early wins from this was actually looking at treatments and therapies as a place where there is really good scaffolding for selecting a problem, for building a goal around it, for breaking it down into concrete steps, for learning from trying those steps and seeing how it should lead to adjusting the goal or adjusting the steps next time in a way that we think can inform human-computer interactions way of designing to support goals. And so that was sort of like an unexpected and nice result. One of the other really big results from it was listening to the transcripts or listening to the audio of sessions and talking with clinicians and clients and seeing the ways in which this goal setting and planning was not working the way that intervention designers had imagined. So in order for skill development here to work, it's really important that the client engage in selecting goals and breaking or selecting problems in problem-solving treatment, building out the plan themselves, getting some support from the clinician, but not having the clinician do it themselves. And what we'd see is that, particularly in time-constrained sessions, where there's a lot of other stuff happening, they start to not get to picking a relevant goal or getting to the right steps within the time allotted, and the clinician would take over. And because these were done on paper worksheets, the clinician would take over and not give it back. And the client would then miss out on the skill development opportunity. And the clinician also, again, trying to hurry things along, again, with really good intents because they're constrained on time, would also end up inadvertently picking a goal or a problem that was not relevant to the client. And so maybe they didn't want to work on it as much between sessions. And so the treatment was not really working in the way that it should be, or always achieving the desired outcomes when this was happening. And so Elena's project ended up directly informing another project that set out to provide better support for problem-solving treatment, right? And so this was particularly looking at the questions of insufficient in-the-moment support for identifying good problems and planning, as well as a challenge that when the process stalled, clinicians would take over selecting irrelevant or less relevant problems and preventing the client's skill development. And so to address this also coincided with the start of COVID when everything was moving to remote and telehealth. We built out an interactive worksheet that was kind of a lot like Google Docs, but with structure, where the clinician and the client could work together on this. And it also included a lot of embedded support or prompts that would help people pick a relevant problem, right? And so this was the idea that rather than having the client or the clinician just take over when the client was stuck, they could go through the prompts together and hopefully do the skill development that needs to happen in problem-solving treatment or for problem-solving treatment to work. So we built out the system and we deployed it in just a very preliminary evaluation where we used it in training and then subsequent treatment and compared it to training and treatment as usual for PST. And this was with 5 clinicians who used the tool called PST Aid and 3 who completed training as usual. The 5, between the 2 groups, they reported comparable usability of problem-solving treatment as a treatment overall and good usability of the tool. There were a couple of issues with the initial build-out that we've since worked to address. And then for treatment, 4 out of the 5 clinicians in the PSTA group certified in 2 sessions, which is the fastest they can certify in the training process. And only 1 out of the 3 PST as usual clinicians was able to certify at all, which is a really big difference. Again, small numbers, but it's indicative that the tool is doing something with providing that in the moment support for scaffolding the clinicians and learning the treatment. As a result, we ended up with really quite different numbers of folks using the PST aid client versus clients using PST as usual. But among the 6 who used PST with the aid, we saw much better improvements in the PHQ-9 at the end of a 9-week follow-up compared to the folks who had PST as usual, which suggests that there's also something happening here in terms of better supporting the intervention in kind of sustained use beyond the training and probably better supporting the skill development. And so we're currently gearing up for a much larger trial with the OCHIN network, as well as rebuilding the application to address some of the usability issues that did come up in this initial preliminary trial. The next project has been led by Jess Janess, and this provided some inter-session support for behavioral activation. And so we went through a 10-week discover process with asynchronous remote studies with 10 mental health clinicians and 1 with 8 different teens. We also drew on Jess's expertise as a clinical investigator and identified ways that BA could be better supported, which primarily ended up being these between session kind of moments where people wanted more structured support for practicing the skills of behavioral activation in the moment, as well as getting some of the data from that practice back into their clinical sessions. We built this out as an interactive app on the Slack platform and then conducted 7 weeks of preliminary evaluation with it with teams and clinicians. And then we did a small pilot test phase. All right, and so some of the things that we built into this were activity and mood logging, a SMART goal diary, and then a bit of a chat bot that could help people work through the problems. I'm not going to go into all the details of this, but this is just to give kind of a sense of the sort of things that DDBT is supporting the design of. I also want to mention that these are very technology-forward examples, right? This, again, reflects the bias of myself and my immediate collaborators as HCI or human-computer interaction researchers. The DDBT process has also been applied to much less technology-forward interventions and implementation strategies, so paper forms, the kinds of training that folks are supported with. And there's an example that you can visit on the ALACRITY website, uwalacrity.org, resources, portfolio of work, case studies. We'll walk through the range of projects funded in the last session. And there's also just a really nice table in a recent paper that we have that kind of summarizes all the work and questions that folks are looking at with this. I also promised that it helped us organize the work of the center across these different projects. And so one of the initial successes there is that we took a look at the center's first 12 or 13 projects and identified common usability issues that showed up across projects with interventions and implementation strategies, and then developed heuristics that we think can better guide the design of interventions and implementation strategies. And so this was really nice, where I don't know that we would have been able to look across this work if we hadn't kind of organized the work of the different project teams according to a framework, and it made our synthesis much easier. We're currently working on a follow-up that actually looks at the redesigns and trying to figure out design patterns that different teams use to address these usability issue categories. So if I were to reflect on this framework and what it did, I think for successes, it was really good at focusing redesign team attention, especially on usability, perhaps because that was the one that was almost easier to provide training and resources for. I feel like engagement rate, as I mentioned, is kind of thorny, and teams struggled with that and looked maybe more to usability as a precursor for engagement too, especially for health researchers and those familiar with implementation science, but not with human-centered design. I think it did a really nice job of scaffolding the process and prompting question asking in a way that made the process accessible. And it didn't provide all the supports for doing it, but at least provided prompts and goals of like, what are we doing in this phase? What should be the outcomes? Okay, now let's go talk with the folks from the center about what kind of method support we need and stuff like that. With this focus on redesign, I think it also accelerates this impact by building on the solid foundations of existing interventions and existing implementation strategies, while adapting them to specific contexts and populations, right? So it's taking that existing foundation and leveraging that investment, but still change it in a way that has a better chance of working. And so I think that's a real strength for getting this stuff into practice. In addition to being used in our ALACRITY Center, this framework's been used by more than 24 K awardees and independent grants. I think we're up to something like 36 now. And then the UW Suicide Care Research Center, another P50 based here at the University of Washington, is also using the DDBT model to organize the work of their teams. And so I take that as kind of a strong endorsement that this is in some way useful for others. That said, I'm not without doubts about this, right, or without concerns. So I do sometimes worry that this emphasis on redesign limits the innovation and fails to test assumptions in existing intervention designs or existing models of delivering care. And so I think there's a risk, as with any redesign process, that it can find local maxima, but misses bigger wins or opportunities that would be associated from a little bit more of a blue sky approach. And so that's a tension. I'm also not sure that DDBT does it as well as supporting human-computer interaction and human-centered design researchers in thinking about what they can or can't modify as part of the redesign process. I think it's much better at supporting implementation science and health researchers at learning design than it is at supporting HCI and HCD researchers at learning implementation science. And that's something I'm still wrestling with a little bit. And so that leads me to this question of, can we design a framework that addresses some of these challenges, right? So I've got these nagging doubts and concerns. And in particular, I want to encourage a greater range of innovation while still drawing on that existing knowledge or leveraging it. And also that provides a bit more guidance and support for coordinating HCI and human-centered design researchers with mental health. So that leads into the next framework. And I will explicitly share that this is a very direct follow-up. Peter presented a very preliminary version of this last summer. And so this is kind of an update on where we've gone with it. And I think the core idea in this framework is that we link different elements of mental health interventions to key concepts in user experience. And so again, I'm connecting back to behavioral activation as a therapy or treatment here. Behavioral activation takes the idea that, in depression, you end up with, if you're experiencing less pressure, you have an increased depressed mood. That makes you not engage in pleasant activity. You experience less pleasure, and so the circle continues. Behavioral activation attempts to disrupt that by having folks engage in pleasant activities. They experience more pleasure, and it starts to disrupt that depressed mood and improve it. And there's a very specific set of mechanisms by which that's supposed to work. So there's some psychoeducation for folks about, hey, this is what's going on with you. And so here's what we're going to try and do in this treatment. And then there's some skill development around problem solving, goal setting, identifying the barriers to solving those problems, and then overcoming folks' avoidances to trying that out. That gets paired with activity and mood monitoring so that as folks go through this process, they're having the opportunity to reflect on how their mood is changing as it relates to activities, and they engage in a repeated set of trials of activation despite this negative experience or this negative mood. And then there's support in the therapy for behavioral rehearsal and in situ practice so that you can do these trials in between sessions as well. Some versions of BA, particularly when used with adolescents, also engage social support from family members to reinforce his repeated trials and the things that folks are supposed to be doing between sessions. And the idea is it leads to reduced depression. Right, and so how do we take this and bridge this to what HCI and human-centered design are good at? And so here, Peter and I really focused on this idea of experience trajectories from Benford et al., which is a canonical or intended journey that users should have through designed experiences. So it includes temporal elements, the roles of different people, the spatial elements, transitions between different interfaces or worlds. In clinical settings, you might think of this as the transition between the therapy session and the rest of someone's life, or even different parts of someone else's life. I really love that it includes beginnings and ends. So how does someone start therapy, right? Or how does someone graduate or kind of be done with it? And then considerations of encounters. All right, so maybe we think of that as the sessions, of the pacing, and then also that different roles may be having their own experiences as they go through it. And so if we take this idea of experience trajectories and look back at a theory of change that guides an intervention, we can start to say, oh yeah, this is saying what people need to go through to have this intervention work for them. And so I think this really nicely bridges the two fields as people are trying to figure out, how do we design to support the theory of change and intervention. And so that leads us to different scopes of contributions to psychosocial intervention design, where you might start, with this intervention system that delivers a full intervention, all the steps of a theory of change necessary for having a psychological impact. So that would be like that model I just showed of behavioral activation. That is comprised of components. So a set of experience which is clearly defined psychological function that serve as part of this wider theory of change. And then components are delivered by capabilities that deliver an interaction element that can be used in many ways that may or may not be part of this complex intervention. And so capabilities don't necessarily have a psychological function. They can be achieved by technology. They could also be achieved or delivered by the clinician or someone else involved in the intervention. And then again, thinking about that implementation science angle, we go back to this intervention implementation where you still have to tailor these intervention systems to work in particular contexts. And so you might include additional implementation strategies or adjunctive interventions like clinician training or supporting access to care to make them actually work. For coordinating among these different scopes, you need design briefs. And so these are expectations for what a given element, capability, component, or intervention system must do to achieve their desired function, constraints under which it must operate. Hopefully it will speak to their use in or use of elements at the other scopes, right? Trying to help bridge those gaps and connect to other pieces. And they could also embed kind of relevant knowledge from a theory of change, from human-computer interaction about what's likely to be effective. And so if we go back to behavioral activation, we might have an activity monitoring design brief, right? And so there might be requirements here of what that activity monitoring is supposed to do in the context of an intervention, including connections to any other elements of the therapy. There also might be assumptions or requirements about the target context, or where is someone supposed to be using this component, and then guidance on appropriate use of the components that meet this design brief, right? So like, here's ethical ways to use it. Here's ways that, you should be watching out for avoiding creating inequalities through its use or something like that. And so from the theory of change for BA, we get this idea of what are the ideal mechanisms, what needs to happen here, how does it need to interface with the other components. From HCI, personal informatics has actually taught us a lot about how people can record what they're doing and reflect on it. And so we can borrow from this knowledge of people's lived experiences and their contexts, as well as different kinds of capabilities and components that might be reused or repurposed for this. And if we're thinking about a technological way of implementing this, computing can tell us something about what's possible, right? If we're thinking about like big ideas like activity inference or stuff like that, and it can also just help us think about robustness and costs. And so we get to these design briefs, and they help us describe what's happening at each of these scopes. Another kind of key part of this is that you can make contributions by both working to an existing design brief, so building something that meets one, or articulating a new design brief of saying, gosh, it would be really helpful if we had something like this, because then it would enable these other kinds of interventions or these other kinds of components, right, if we had this new technical capability. So I want to talk a little bit about innovation in different scopes. And here I'm actually borrowing a lot from some work from James Fogarty on systems research, where he's kind of made the argument of like, yeah, you can still make a systems contribution even if your whole system isn't novel. So you could, for example, make a contribution by building a novel intervention entirely from existing components, right? And showing a new way to put them together, do something that maybe people hadn't imagined before. You could also end up doing a novel component, right, where that's your contribution. It's like, look, we figured out how to do activity monitoring in a totally new way. And this is going to enable one or more kinds of new and novel interventions. You don't actually have to build that intervention. You just have to argue compellingly for the utility of that new component in the novel intervention. All right. You could also end up building a novel capability that enables a sketch of a novel component, right? So let's say that we have this new ability for inferring activity. Okay, maybe I can now describe how that would be useful for a new kind of activity monitoring component. And you could even then go as far as say, and this might also inform new kinds of interventions that we can't build yet. Right? And so these might just still be sketches, but by linking these, you can help show how that new capability you developed might be useful in this setting. You can also end up building novel capabilities that replace existing capabilities that would let an intervention system work for more people at lower cost or more reliably. So let's say that you have something that used to take, for example, a trained clinician to do, and you can now show that your chatbot, everyone's trying this, I'm not endorsing this idea, but you can now show this chatbot is able to do it as well. Okay, so now we can think about scale and addressing some of our service gap. And so I feel like those are the ones that jump out perhaps the most, but it also leaves open room for critique of practices or directions of the field as a kind of contribution. And there's been some really awesome work that kind of looks at the direction of parts of HCI and says, wait, we should be going in a different direction. We're building kind of mass surveillance systems, or we're really kind of reinforcing existing power relationships and clinical and client relationships, and has offered this valuable critique. So you can also critique design briefs that represent the direction of the field, and that is still a valuable contribution here. And then there's also been a lot of really fantastic work on understanding the lived experiences of people with implemented interventions or the technologies that they're using that can help us understand what maybe future design briefs should or shouldn't do, or ways in which they're working or for whom they're working or not, where you're not necessarily quite articulating a new design brief or building in response to one, but you're informing us about, okay, if you go with this design brief, here's the kind of folks for whom it's working, or the ways in which it's working for people and not. And then you can go from that to design briefs or sketches for these novel components where maybe you haven't built it yet, and maybe you haven't shown its efficacy yet, but you're starting to outline it in a way that it hopefully articulates like a research agenda for the field or fields. Okay. So where do I hope this framework goes? Or both Peter and I think we really hope that the design briefs at these different scopes, tied to the theories of change behind interventions, and that draws on HCI and HCD knowledge, can guide human-computer interactions contributions to design of psychosocial interventions for health, while at the same time not overly constraining the innovation to iteration on existing interventions. Right, so as I just covered, this makes it explicit that you can propose new interventions that don't exist yet, or that couldn't have existed before the development of certain capabilities. Hopefully, it can also inform evaluations and expectations of evaluations at these different scopes by tying them with the design briefs. I hope that by introducing this vocabulary, we can increase the uptake of some really great HCI innovations in the mental health space. And then by including explicitly this implemented intervention level in the framework, that it will increase HCI's attention on implementation science. And so for the last 4 minutes or so here before we go to Q&A, I want to say that I am not sure that it totally achieves that goal, right? I think it's easy to lose that in the broader context of the paper. And so the last thing I want to cover is maybe a way that we can start thinking about this. And this comes out of a CHI 2023 workshop that had lots of participants, some of whom are on the call. So have at this and see where we got to with it. I think kind of a core idea of that workshop on integrating human-computer interaction and implementation science is that HCI is very good at innovating to meet local needs. It evaluates but rarely changes the setting. Like if I think of how I was trained as a designer or an HCI researcher, it was always like, oh, the setting and the context, you've got to design to match the context. As I've worked more in the implementation science space, actually, well, sometimes what you have to do is you have to understand the context, but then you can actually think about these implementation strategies or adjunctive interventions that seek to change the setting or the organization in a way that prepares the intervention to succeed. And so I think that, really extending HCI's lens to include this implementation stage will open up some new ways that we think as designers. And so again, if we go back to that double diamond model of design, one of the things that we're proposing is to add a third diamond that represents implementation science, right? So if we go back to kind of Curran's idea and some of the things embedded in the double diamond model, the first part is design the right thing, then design the thing right, so iteration, prototyping, and refinement, and then designing for uptake. So identify and address the determinants that affect what's going to affect this working in an organization, design the adjunctive or supporting interventions that will help prepare the groundwork for it to work in a sustainable way. And so hopefully you can get better to solutions sustainment than current HCI practice does. So where am I at with this? I really love that this triple diamond model pushes the HCI and HCD to think more about preparing or changing organizations for innovation adoption, right? Like if I go back to, again, how I was trained as a student, that was taboo. It was like, no, we've kind of abandoned that. We're going to just figure out how to design so well that we fit the organizational context. And I don't like that we kind of treated that as like, don't touch that, right? And so I love this push to think about it. And I love that it also gets HCI thinking about sustainment. I really don't like, and I'm very uncomfortable with the idea that implementation shows up mostly in that third diamond, where it could imply that implementation comes at the end of a design process rather than something you need to plan for from the start. And so Ravi, who I saw was on the call earlier, has been working on kind of helping us develop a figure that really emphasizes that, no, you need to start thinking about this from the beginning. And then I also sometimes still think that human-centered design needs to design things that are currently unsustainable to help us imagine the ways that things can be unsustainable. So, right, so sometimes human-centered design time travels or goes to these places where it's like, we know that this won't work right now. Billing codes don't support it. The world doesn't support it. But by showing you that this is valuable, maybe you'll be motivated to change. What I don't think we do well as a field is then actually go through the work of helping the organization change to like make billing for kind of remote care or between session support something that can happen. And I do wonder if this model should better support theory and trajectories, and that's coming off of having just developed the last one. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I think that, the folks who I look to for mentorship on this are mostly on this call or at this center. So I'd love to, almost turn around to some questions for you and see what you all think, right? So I do think that we've got these 3 frameworks now. Each has its own emphasis. DDBT better emphasizes design to an implementation science audience. The Kai mental health or HCI and mental health framework is more about thinking about scopes and coordinating between fields. And the triple diamond model better emphasizes implementation science to an HCI audience. And so maybe, each of these has its own audience and is good, but I do wonder, if we could perhaps combine or better integrate these for communication. I'd love to know how you kind of reflect on this comparing to the models you're using over there at CBITs. What are collaborators am I missing? And so before I kind of turn it over to questions and comments, Jen, just a huge thanks to funders and the many collaborators on this work, even beyond kind of who I could highlight on the slides. Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you. I love now that Zoom does these like flying emojis during talks. There was a few that came through. I don't know if you're able to see them. I wish this could be more discussion based. The limitations are I will have to be the go-between. So I really encourage people to particularly they're all flying. It's so awesome. That as Sean continues to to think on things, it would be great for those that have been thinking about ACTS or implementation science or whatever to use their Q&A as a discussion point or even the chat as well. But in the meantime, as they're coming in, one question was that I want to just share that there was a question about if the recording and slides will be available. So the recording it'll be on our YouTube, our center's YouTube site and linked to our website soon. But I did want to ask Sean, is that something that you would be open to sharing the slides themselves?
Yes.
I don't know how we would quite do that. And this is from an anonymous attendee. So
so I think I could probably put them, I have a talk section on my website. And so if you give me after the weekend, I can put them there. I can send it under. We have our PhD visit days later this week. And so I'm just I'll need the weekend.
Yeah, you are in lots of great. This is great. The next question, and I love this question from Elena Carr around, can you discuss how best to partner with web developers and technology experts throughout HCI trajectory?
Yeah, so this is a great question. I don't have a great answer for you, just to apologize. I think one of the hopes is that this model that we've introduced, kind of the middle one with the different scopes, may help kind of provide some I don't know if it helps with like day-to-day collaboration, but especially in terms of planning grants where it's like, no, we want to do a new intervention. No, we're really focused on just doing this component, right? And sort of thinking about the scope of work with developers or designers about what's being changed and also what we're not trying to change. We have another paper that is in work, and I can also share, there's a list of tips that is going in that paper of kind of human-centered design for grant writers, but a lot of that is on here's how to build a team. Here's when you think you might work with, for example, a student developer. Here's why you maybe don't want to work with a student developer if it's in your critical path. If you're working with an outside company, kind of definitely encourage interviewing of several. And I think you'll always have to take on some risk, right? And so sometimes the risk is they're just a big firm and they're very expensive, but that means that if, someone moves on, they'll have someone else who can join your team. Often now we've been working with individual developers on very clearly scoped things that will finish before they move on. Whenever you negotiate a contract, and unfortunately some colleagues have learned this the hard way, make sure that you retain access to all of the code no matter what, right? So there are some firms out there that unfortunately will give you a low initial hourly rate, and then now your grant's been awarded, but now, and you need some changes, and now they're charging more, and you don't have access to the code, and that's just hugely expensive. As well as if it's built on any proprietary platforms, make sure you have access to it, at least for the life of your study, probably longer. But yeah, I can send a pointer to that one.
I was on mute, working in our Zoom world all these years. But I agree in terms of excellent points. And so we now have a comment from Alan. Wonderful presentation. Can you share outcomes from this process, examples of successful end products used by the public from enacting this process?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. We're not there yet, to be honest. I think there are several that are approaching kind of R01 style trials in kind of their use. So we're looking at that for, again, that kind of link to the center's portfolio, I think is a really good one to see kind of where different projects are at. The PhD aid one I shared is coming up on R01. The behavioral activation supports is coming up on a small trial as part of an R34. There's been some tedious redevelopment to move from Slack to Teams, which the hospital that we're partnering with uses. And so that's really slowed us down. Some of the ones that did redefine papers, so there's a suicidality assessment worksheet, that's already in use, right? It's much easier to implement paper changes than technology changes in many cases. And then one of the things that we're doing in our renewal of the center is that I do think that this researcher-led process, which I think it's fair to say that our initial version of the center was that, is kind of slow in the sense of it goes through the traditional NIH model of translation. And so one of the things that we'd really love to do is build out some supports for researchers, or like local redesign teams within community organizations or service settings at doing their own adaptation and applying some of the design process. And that's a tricky one because we want to make design accessible, but we don't want to like cheapen or undermine the expertise necessary to do it when it's a bigger redesign. All right, and so kind of trying to balance like, here's the stuff that you probably should and could do on your own, and here's how to evaluate it, and here's how we can support you, versus like, here's when you bring in some outside design expertise to support you. And so that's, I think, a big challenge for us for the next 4 years.
We'll be lucky to learn about all the solutions you then come up with and how to do those processes. Amisha Walia has a great question that also I think in and of itself has lots of good pain points around. Can you comment about the entrance to the clinical setting and the intersection of HCI and intervention design? Do you have frameworks or suggestions for when entering the clinical setting for this remote or integration into the EHR in clinical settings? And that to
Yeah,
me there.
You're asking great questions or hard questions, right? And maybe you're asking them because all of us want an answer to these questions, and there isn't a great one. I think for entering in clinical settings, the best thing I can say is start early with finding partners and really build the time to build a shared research agenda where you're working on their problems, not like using them as a site to solve your problems, right? And so really taking the months, years to find the shared questions and goals, sharing the power in the decision-making as you go through that. Same thing with patient organizations or patient representatives. my reflection on the EHR is that while it has become easier to integrate things in the HR over the years, it is a good way to spend all of your budget really fast and achieve nothing. And so almost everything that we've done and shown here, we've built outside of the EHR first. And the most we've done is like have an automated way to put a link in the notes field. And that's been really good for letting us prototype quickly and iterate quickly. PSD 8, as we move to this larger RO1, is going to have more EHR integration, and we are in the throes of figuring that out. But I think, right, again, having built the prototype and getting preliminary evidence has also helped really increase the motivation for it. And that's been kind of everything that I had that has eventually been integrated with an electronic health record system. We've had the outside promising data so that there is demand from clinicians for it and demand from patients for it, which then motivates the health system to be like, okay, let's have this conversation. But it's hugely expensive.
We have a question from Arca saying you mentioned that products should be developed so that users can, quote, graduate from the programs. Most of the commercial apps nowadays have a subscription model that assumes users will keep on using the apps forever. Do you have any thoughts on how a business model would work for products intended for short-term or intermittent engagement?
Yeah, I mean, so there is kind of this underlying challenge of like, whether it's mental health interventions or behavior change apps, right? They have no incentive for you to actually like learn to do these things on your own, right? If the payer is you, right? You see this too with like wearables, right? Where if your wearable was something that you didn't depend on for physical activity, right? Then or if you learn to not depend on it, then you stop buying new devices, and that would be bad, right? From their business model perspective. And so I think part of the answer is changing the payer, right? So when insurance is motivated to pay for these things, maybe they're more motivated to say, well, here's your 10 sessions of kind of asynchronous support for those sessions. Here's like your asynchronous support for after those sessions, right? As you continue to practice and rehearse those skills. And then at some point, you're done, right? And the insurance company is happy to stop paying, right? So changing the payer is probably the best answer I have. Again, the questions here are great and are things that I'm wrestling with. We're also writing a tiny planning grant proposal and trying to identify, what are these translational barriers for these things that work at the intersection of the consumer level, where the consumer product is frankly ready to deploy and test earlier, sooner than the clinical facing side. But then we go and we translate the consumer facing side, and that's the business model that takes hold, and it sort of co-opts the ultimate vision of it. And so I know we're trying to figure that one out too.
We have about 1 minute. So the speed one is Andrew Berry's interest in theory of change here. It seems to be working at multiple levels: theory of behavior change, theory of changing health practice, theory of changing health institutions. Does this new model intentionally address theories of change at the different levels? And if so, does it make links across these?
That's a good question. I would love your reaction to the paper, right? Your honest critique of it, if you have a chance to dive in. I think it is our aspiration that it does. But it's possible too that at more like the capability and the component level, you might actually not be relying on a theory of change other than to like describe what it's supposed to do in the broader intervention. And you might be relying more on HCI theory about like, here's what a leaderboard does to change people's motivation, or here's what like rewards do, or stuff like that.
Thank you. This was amazing. There's way more questions in here that are just outstanding. So I think we'll want to have just continued more conversation. Maybe we can get you to Chicago again and have continued discussion about all of this excellent stuff. I want to just quickly mention there was someone on the call. This is one of the amazing things about Sean, you actually really attracted lots of new people, it seems, to this call. So someone, Joshua Miller, you asked about any primers in implementation science. I think a lot of people on this call would be very thrilled by this question. I would encourage you to check out Northwestern has a reading course in implementation science. I'm not sure if you're affiliated with Northwestern, but there's lots of resources because it's a burgeoning field that really wants to train more individuals. So UW has stuff, WashU in St. Louis, so Penn. So there's lots of things, and I'll put in a plug for the Society of Implementation Research Collaboration as well, which totally took us in a different direction that I was thinking we would end on. So all of that just to say thank you, Sean. Would look forward to following up on some of this and hearing as all of this amazing work progresses. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And again, happy for critique, because I will freely acknowledge that some of these things we're putting them out there in hopes that they're useful. And if they're wrong, or you're worried that it doesn't allow for the kind of work that you do and think is important, I want to hear it so that we can clarify that and make sure you feel like you're included and it helps too.
Design to design in theory. Love it. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.